Some years ago, the world was mesmerised by the last battle in a terrible family war fought over the life and death of Terry Schiavo, in which her parents and her husband argued bitterly for control of her life, or what remained of it. The funny thing is that at the start of his marriage, Michael Schiavo called his parents-in-law Mum and Dad. By all accounts, they were a close, loving, supportive family. So when Terry Schiavo suffered irreversible brain damage in 1990, it surprised absolutely no one when Michael's parents-in-law moved in with Michael to help him take care of Terry. And for 3 years, this is how they lived, jointly attending to a wife and a daughter whom they loved deeply. Apparently, the arguments first started in 1993, not long after Michael Schiavo won a malpractice suit against Terry's doctors and was awarded just over $1 million. He claimed that his parents-in-law wanted some of the money for themselves. They claimed that they just wanted a say in how to best care for their daughter. Each side in this increasingly bitter conflict felt legitimately entitled to make decisions about Terry's life. And each side was absolutely convinced that the other was the villain. Accordingly, Michael Schiavo felt justified in blocking his in-laws' access to their daughter's medical records. And they in turn felt justified in attempting to have him removed as her legal guardian. The husband was offended by what he saw as his in-laws' crass efforts to get their hands on some of the settlement. They were offended by what he saw as his selfish moves to end their daughter's life. By the time their sad story made it onto our television screens and newspapers, each side's position had become irrational and intransigent. So much so that after Terry died, her parents had to get a court order to find out where Michael had buried their daughter. This morning I want to talk about the little feuds, the conflicts, the arguments that make each of our lives such a pain. And I want to teach you that in those conflicts, we very quickly commit to an opinion as to who is to blame. And then once that commitment is made, we then create a fiction which makes our subsequent behaviour entirely permissible. In every single conflict, from the pages of our social media to the stadiums of Manchester, from our family weddings to the street corners of Fallujah, someone is always saying, "But they started it." And, "But what about?" They started it. But what about? And with these subtle phrases, we fool ourselves into thinking that we are right to do what we do because they were wrong to do what they did. In the 15th chapter of the book of Judges, we're told that later on, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. So the background to this story is that the hero Samson has had a falling out with his wife. It happens. Not to you, I know. And this was quite a severe falling out, the kind of falling out that ends with doors being slammed and the wife packing her bags and going back to live with her parents. And so for a couple of days, Samson's okay with this. He enjoys, fantastic sleeps. It's good. And then after a couple of days, he decides, I should probably go and make up with my wife. I miss her. House needs cleaned. I don't know. So, like any sensible man, he understands he shouldn't go empty-handed. So, couldn't find a Laura Seacourt. The florist was closed, so he buys a goat. And with goat in hand, he goes to his in-laws and he knocks on the door, talks to the father-in-law and says, "I'm going to my wife's room." Now, you probably gather that the nuance here is entirely sexual. The best part of falling out with your partner is the make-up sex afterwards. And so clearly he doesn't want to have a chat in the family room or a cup of tea in the kitchen. He wants to go to her room with the goat. I don't know either. But the father-in-law says, you can't go in. The reason being, I was so sure you thoroughly hated her that I gave her to your friend. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead. So already, you know, we're already deep into dysfunction. It's only sentence number 2, and we're deep into dysfunction. I gave your wife to your friend, but don't worry about it, because to be perfectly honest, she was the ugliest of my daughters. Go to her sister's room, she's way better looking. Trust me, take the goat, it'll be fun. Now, as an aside, the father and his 2 daughters in this story belong to an ethnic group called Philistines, and one of the subtexts of the early books of the Bible is that the Philistines mistreat women, which the Hebrew scriptures don't approve of. Samson in this story, he's a Jew, not a Philistine, and so he regards this behavior as not only morally reprehensible, but as personally hurtful. He liked his wife. He wanted to make up with her. He even dropped good money on a goat. And now these inbred, uncultured Philistines have taken that from him, and they've done so in a particularly grotesque way. Now, what I want you to notice about sentence number 2 of this story is the way the father-in-law justifies his obscene behavior. So notice he doesn't say, I just spoke this dysfunctional sentence because I'm a deviant. Doesn't say that. He doesn't say, I just spoke this dysfunctional sentence and did this dysfunctional thing because I actually hate you and I quite enjoy messing with your head. He doesn't say that. None of that at all. It's just, the reason I did what I did was because of you and not me. I was so sure, notice, that you hated her, that's why I did what I did. The root of this dysfunction, you see, it's not me at all. I'm just an innocent party in all of this weirdness. The root of this dysfunction is your behavior, not mine. Every family, even your own, has tales to tell of insults, of unforgivable slights and wounds and never-ending feuds. She didn't come to my wedding, yada, yada, yada. He stole my inheritance, yada, 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 yada. When my father got sick and needed someone to take care of him, my brother disappeared, left me to pick up the pieces and carry the load. And in those stories in our families and in our lives, no one is ever going to say that the reason they insulted and the reason they cheated and the reason they abandoned and whatever was entirely without provocation. Only a monster would do that. And in my experience, most people are not monsters. In almost every conflict, what happens is that each side justifies its opinion by claiming that the other side is to blame. And then each side is simply responding to the offence or the insult or the injury as any reasonable moral person would do. So of course I didn't come to your wedding. Of course I didn't. Because last year when I went through my breakup, where were you? Of course I took more than my fair share of our parents' inheritance and cheated you out of your end, because 40 years ago you got to go to college and I didn't. Who started it? What about? Each person says it was the other, and that is what makes these scenarios so intractable in each of our lives. We justify our bitterness and our ongoing anger by saying that the other person is to blame. And of all the stories that we tell to justify our lives, our loves, and our losses, the ones that lock us into conflicts by justifying our view of being a victim are the most damaging. Next sentence then. Samson said to them, "This time I really have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them." This is the classic rationale for doing something stupid. So notice that the main headline in this is not the wrong I'm about to do. No, don't focus on that. The main headline here is the wrong that was done to me. All I'm doing is responding. I'm the victim, and my victimhood gives me a right to do what I am about to do. How many times have you justified treating someone shabbily with the phrase, "But what about?" How many times have you justified, frankly, unchristian behavior with the prefix, "But what about?" They started it. As though what they did gives you a pass from Christianity. As though somehow your successful living of a Jesus-following life depends entirely on someone else's behavior. So he went out and he caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails. He lit the torches and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. Remember, this is, in sentence 1 we learned, this is the wheat harvest. This is the time when you're just about to get your money and cash in. And he burned up the shocks and the standing grain together with the vineyards and the olive groves. A little segue into the Discovery Channel here. In the ancient world, this was quite a common thing to do. So if you had an enemy whose economy was almost entirely agrarian, then one of the most effective things that you could do to defeat your enemy was to destroy their crops. Because if they had no crops, then they had no food and they had no money. And if they had no food or money, they had no ability to wage war against you. So this sentence is quite common in the ancient world. Hannibal the Great did this in 217, fighting against the Romans. Set fire to some cows, I think. Probably had it coming. And let the cows loose on the Romans' crops, and he beat them. So understand then that what Samson is doing here is in fact an act of war. It's an act of war. So notice that this act escalates absolutely everything. A few sentences ago, his wife got married to another guy. He responds to this by starting a war. But that's not the main point. The main point, notice what he says, is I have a right to get even. Is he getting even? Is this even remotely equitable, what he's doing? He fell out with his wife, he starts a war. His wife ran off with another guy or was given to another guy. He destroys the livelihood and economies of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of families. Are these positions even remotely equitable? Of course not. But it's not about what I did, it's about what they did. Getting even, by the way, is almost impossible. There was one fun experiment in which brain scientists asked couples to put their fingers in essentially a torture device. And in this device, pressure would be applied to each person's finger. And the participants were instructed to apply the same amount of force of pressure to their partner's finger that they just felt. So the idea was your partner squeezes your finger in this torture device, and then you try to squeeze their finger with exactly the same amount of pain that you just felt. And the idea of the experiment was to figure out if you could get even. And what they discovered was that no matter how hard each person in the couple tried to be equitable in their revenge, they found it impossible. So every single time one partner felt pressure on their finger, they retaliated with considerably greater force, thinking that that was the pressure that had just been given to them. This is why two boys in a playground start out play fighting, often end up in an actual fight. This is why a trivial conflict about nothing often ends up being a serious conflict about something. We can't get even. Our brains are wired to inflict more pain than they receive. Does that say something about your conflicts, about your divorces, about your bitternesses? We're wired this way. So next sentence. When the Philistines asked who did this, they were told, Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his friend. Fair enough question, right? You wake up in the morning and you see your life's work in ashes. In fact, in the case of the vineyards and the olive trees, generations worth of work in ashes. And so they ask, who did this? Why would someone do this? And they hear the story about Samson's weird father-in-law and the dysfunctional situation with his wife, blah, blah, blah. So, the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. It's fair enough. It's totally legit. And at this point, I have several questions. My first question would be, did that feel good? I mean, I get how when you woke up in the morning and you saw your life's work in ashes, you felt bad. But when you went up to this person's house and you threw them in a fire, did that make you feel better? Did the smell of their burning flesh and the agonizing screams coming out of their lungs and their writhing in agony, did all that somehow become therapy in your pain? Did their pain make you forget about your own? And perhaps the more important question that I have of these people is, do you feel bad about what you just did? Do you feel even remotely evil about burning a father and daughter to death? Or do you feel justified in doing what you did? Most people, as I said earlier, are not bad people. And so when they do something bad, it creates dissonance, tension in their brain. I'm not a bad person. I just did a bad thing. And one of the most common ways that we reduce this tension is by saying that this person started it and therefore they deserve it. And once people commit themselves to an opinion about who started this, whatever the this may be, a family conflict or an international dispute, they become less able to adapt to new information that contradicts their position. Once we decide who the victim is and who the perpetrator is, our ability to empathize and to progress is significantly weakened. How many arguments have been started with the unanswerable, but what about? And this is why this week, while some people were talking about the horror of what happened in Manchester, other people were talking about what happens in Palestine. This is why this week, while some people were talking about what happened on a bus in Egypt, other people were saying, but what about how Christian colonial powers treated Egyptians in the 18th and 19th centuries? This is why when some people talk about the horrors of what Islamic terrorists do, other people say, but what about what Pope Urban II said in 1095, when he said that killing Muslims was the duty of every Christian and was a gateway to heaven? But what about, who started it, and on and on and on it goes. So therefore, Samson said to them, since you have acted like this, I won't stop till I get revenge on you. Notice again the psyche. This isn't about what I've done. This is about since you've done this thing. I mean, me destroying your crops and starting a war, that was just rational. That was legitimate. But now what you've done, oh no. So we're told he attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. In Hebrew, this sentence is much more interesting. In Hebrew, this sentence reads something like, he piled leg on thigh. He piled leg on thigh. In other words, there were body parts everywhere. This was like a scene from 300 or a slasher movie. This is Freddy and Jason on steroids, episode 7, the gory chapter, right? This is a mess. And then after there's bodies everywhere, there's leg piled on thigh, the text says he went down and stayed in the rock of Etam. And as he goes there on his own and he sits and he reflects, I want to know Samson, a hero of the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, someone spoken of positively in the New Testament. I want to know, do you feel bad I mean, this has been quite a day you've just lived. You've started a war, and you've left body parts lying all over a field. You've made hundreds of widows and orphans. You've destroyed the livelihoods of entire villages. I want to know, do you as a good person feel bad, even remotely evil, about what you did? Probably not. In 2004, the Western world was shocked to learn about the abuse of Iraqi prisoners of war at the Abu Ghraib detention centre. And we were doubly shocked to learn that it was a female guard, Lynnie England, who was involved in this contravention of the Geneva Convention. Okay, so there was this hand-wringing horror in Western society and in the news and the newspapers. Not only were good, moral, on mission from God kind of language, Western soldiers involved in the abuse of harmless prisoners. It was a woman who was doing this. And for weeks the Western press wrung their hands trying to figure out how a thing like this could happen. And the conclusion that society came to was that, well, this woman must have been evil. That's the only possible explanation. Because only an evil person could inflict pain and humiliation on defenseless prisoners. But that is, in fact, unlikely. Only a monster would deliberately inflict pain and humiliation on defenseless prisoners. And Lynnie England probably wasn't a monster. Her position was, I'm a good person. I volunteered to serve my country. I just believed that, it was just after 9/11. And these people were kind of tied up with those people, and these people were attacking our troops and our convoys, and there was IEDs and all that stuff. And somehow their behaviour justified my behaviour. And so the position that she came to was, I am a good person. Therefore, if I deliberately inflict pain and humiliation on somebody else, they must have deserved it. Therefore, when I do evil, I'm not doing evil. I'm doing good. And isn't that the same perversion that plays out in so many of your conflicts and mine? Because of what they did to you, when you do wrong, you are not doing wrong. You are doing good. How twisted the lies we tell ourselves are. It goes on and it gets worse. The Philistines went up and they camped at Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The men of Judah asked, why have you come to fight us? They said, we have come to take Samson prisoner, they answered, to do to him as he did to us. Notice how this goes on. You hurt me, I want to get my own back and hurt you. I want you to feel pain because you made me feel pain. At no point does anyone stand up and say, I might be making this worse. Last verse. Then 3,000 men. What? That's a lot of men. 3,000 men. This morning it was a guy and a goat. Going off to make up with his wife. Now there's 3,000 men involved. So these men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Etam, and they said to Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? Then look at what Samson said to them. I merely did to them what they did to me. Merely. Dude, you destroyed an entire economy and chopped up hundreds of bodies and piled them leg on thigh. By no stretch of the English language are any of your actions remotely covered by the use of the word merely. Do you see what he's saying? It's the same thing you say in your conflicts. It's the same logic you use to justify your own bad behaviour. I am actually the good guy in this story. I'm the hero of this tale I tell. So, here you are, and you're a Christian. The question these texts force us to ask ourselves is, are we behaving like a Christian in the feuds and the conflicts and the arguments that make our lives such a pain? These things are inevitable. We all have fights. We can't get on with everyone all of the time. But your behaviour is entirely your own choice. Is it Christian? And if you've already answered that question in your head by saying, but what about? Or if they started it, you're wrong. Have a look at this. Writing to the church in Rome, the Apostle Paul said, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody." So this is an important biblical point. You should not allow someone else's behaviour to become the excuse for your behaviour. Your behaviour as a Christian is to be influenced entirely by your internal sense of what's right and wrong, and not by the external things that are done to you or are happening around you. You as a Christian have signed up for the way of Jesus. And if that is so, then the way other people treat you is to have almost no effect on the way you choose to treat them. Next sentence. He says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Sometimes, of course, it isn't possible. Some people are idiots. They never change. They'll always be toxic. They'll always be dangerous. And for your safety and sanity and that of your family, you probably should limit the amount of time you spend around them. But nevertheless, caveat given, as far as it depends on you, make an effort. And then he says, do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, says the Lord. I will repay." We're out of time, so I'll just wrap this up with... Let's go to our next slide. Here's the standard for a Christian. There's no but what about, and there's no they started it. The standard is Jesus. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Next slide. Jesus said, you've heard it said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. Who doesn't? But the standard of Christianity is higher. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Do you know what hatred is? It is a fundamental waste of life. It gives power to a past that cannot be changed. Like, get that into your head. The past cannot be changed. All hatred does is keep it alive. And more concerningly, it robs you of a future that can be changed, that is entirely unwritten. Thank you for coming. God bless you. See you next Sunday.